Last week, the Public Accounts Committee finished taking evidence in public. Now it's preparing its report. And in the meantime, the Moriarty Tribunal is focusing attention on Charles Haughey's apparent misuse of the party leader's allowance to pay private bills. Now, that's not just a matter of history. At issue now is the question, how far is the present Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, implicated? David Nally has this report.
Once again, an inquiry is trying to establish what Bertie Ahern remembers and whether his memory squares with that of other people. It has its work cut out, because it's not always clear what Bertie Ahern means when he talks about Charles Haughey's alleged abuse of state money from the Fianna Fáil leader's allowance. The allowance is paid into this branch of AIB, and it's money given by the state for legitimate spending on the running of the party, like staff wages and office equipment. It's definitely not intended as pocket money for the leader personally. During the years Charles Haughey was leader, the allowance totalled over £1 million. 2 years ago, when the Moriarty Tribunal was being set up, Dick Spring asked Bertie Ahern to allow the tribunal to investigate whether Haughey had abused this leader's allowance. But Bertie Ahern refused. He said he'd checked out the leader's allowance, and as far as he could be, he was sure it hadn't been abused. One of the reasons he gave was that another senior party figure, apart from Mr. Haughey, co-signed all of the checks. But that explanation didn't survive scrutiny, because last year it emerged that while Mr. Haughey was Taoiseach, £25,000 from that account had gone to an account in Guinness and Mahon Bank, controlled by his accountant Des Traynor, and presumably for his own personal use. The cheque had been co-signed by Bertie Ahern, and it transpired that the mysterious senior party figure to whom he'd referred was in fact himself. Mr. Ahern also explained that his investigation of the leader's allowance had only covered the years while Fianna Fáil was in opposition. It wasn't just that cheque that went in a mysterious direction from the leader's allowance account. £16,000 went for expensive French Charvet shirts, around £17,000 on expensive restaurants and hotels, and all of the cheques were co-signed by Bertie Ahern. That left the Taoiseach walking a tightrope. It's crucial to his reputation that he didn't know what those cheques were for when he signed them, but it's also important that he didn't simply sign large numbers of blank cheques, leaving the account wide open to this abuse. Eileen Foy, the secretary who administered the account, implied to the Moriarty Tribunal last June that it was routine for Mr. Ahern to sign blank cheques. The tribunal questioned her about how the system was operated by herself and Mr. Ahern.
In the normal course of doing the work, you received the bills.
Yeah?
You had a number of blank cheques which had been pre-signed by Mr. Ahern.
Yes.
You would fill the name of the payee and the amount in the cheque-book.
Yes.
You would take them to Mr. Haughey, and in the normal course of business, whatever few queries may have been raised, he signed them. You take them away. Is that correct?
Yes.
Today at the tribunal, Eileen Foy was asked whether she agreed with Mr. Ahern's memory of this system. She said she wouldn't disagree, and added that she would never ask him to pre-sign blank cheques without telling him what they would ultimately be used for. So what did the Taoiseach himself say to the tribunal last June? Were the cheques always blank when he signed them? Were they usually blank? Or were they only occasionally blank? The truth is, it's hard to pin down what he was saying. In one answer, the Taoiseach was at pains to show how rigorous the system was. He said that Eileen Foy would come to him with a number of bills that needed to be paid and a chequebook. She would bring the type list to me. She would go through what companies there were, and I would sign them. Does that mean the cheques were generally not blank when Mr. Ahern signed them? If so, how does that square with what Eileen Foy told the tribunal? And how does it square with the transcript of Mr. Ahern's later evidence, when he listed the occasions when he would sign blank cheques from his Foy? Perhaps on the day, or maybe twice monthly, into a weekend or bank holiday weekend, Christmas break, Dáil recess, multiple reasons. Given that having two signatures on a cheque is generally considered an important control against abuse, and given that Mr. Ahern is an accountant, that seems on the face of it to be an awful lot of exceptions, especially when we now know what ultimately happened to some of those cheques.
That report by David Nally. Joining me to discuss the political implications of this latest episode of the Moriarty Tribunal, Stephen Collins, political editor of the Sunday Tribune. Stephen, how close is all of this getting to Bertie Ahern? What are the political implications?
Well, there are political implications for Bertie Ahern. His Dáil statement of 2 years ago, where he made an emphatic statement that the account was used for bona fide purposes, has really put it up to him. And it's the subsequent evidence that he signed over 1,600 cheques himself, that some of these cheques were used for such purposes as going into Charles Haughey's personal account, for buying the Charvet shirts, for dinners in the Cockardee. All these things are now posing questions for Bertie Ahern. Why did he sign the cheques, or how did he sign the cheques? Were they all blank? As your report from David Nally said there, Bertie Ahern has given confusing answers to those questions. He has said on one occasion in his evidence that he was generally told what the cheques were for. On the other hand, whenever any controversial cheque comes up, it was always a blank cheque. So it's coming closer to him, and I think he has some further explaining to do.
Can any of it be explained away? I mean, there's this suggestion that these big bills in the Cockardee was the cabinet going out. So, now, my general experience with various kinds of governments is they don't socialise that much together. They may have a Christmas lunch, but that's about it.
Well, exactly. You put your finger on it with a Christmas lunch. I was talking to one former Fianna Fáil minister who was in that government who remembers a Christmas lunch in the Cockardee. He can only remember going there once. Generally speaking, the cabinet didn't adjourn after cabinet meetings, not as a whole, and maybe some members of the cabinet did, but I think that's unlikely. It appears Mr. Haughey himself had the use of a private dining room in the restaurant and was there with friends on various occasions. So we don't know precisely what the money was used for, but it seems unlikely that much of it was used on what would be regarded as bona fide Fianna Fáil purposes.
On the Fianna Fáil benches in the Dáil, how much concern is now being expressed?
Well, there is some concern on the Fianna Fáil backbenches that this just won't go away. There was a general feeling when Bertie Ahern took office that the past had been put behind, that the Haughey era was over. But the Haughey era keeps coming back to grab at Mr. Ahern. And by his own statements in the Dáil, mind you, he has done a lot to leave it hanging over him, because he gave such ambiguous answers. He left himself open at some future date that it was going to be hauled back. And I think he will now face difficulties considering the tribunal's evidence.
We all remember the experience of those Haughey years. Is there a very simple explanation that Bertie Ahern, in common with some of his colleagues, was simply afraid of Mr. Haughey and would not confront him?
Well, certainly Bertie Ahern and all his other colleagues in government were afraid of Mr. Haughey. Some were on his side. Bertie Ahern was always a Haughey loyalist, but they certainly wouldn't have confronted Mr. Haughey, because then they come to the original question: why was Bertie Ahern's name on the account for so long? He himself told the tribunal it is because he was chief whip, but he wasn't chief whip of the party between 1987 and 1992, yet his name remained on the account, and he signed all of these cheques. While he was there, he hasn't provided an answer for that yet. But generally, within the party, people didn't have the courage to stand up to him. Those who did, like Des O'Malley, like Mary Harney, found their way out of Fianna Fáil, or were pushed out of Fianna Fáil very fast. So again, it is the whole culture that developed during the Haughey era, which is, I think, coming back now to haunt Bertie Ahern.
Stephen Collins, thank you for being with us.